There's an Academy Award-winning movie that came out in 1981 called Chariots of Fire. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's a great movie. It's the story about the 1924 Olympic Games. And specifically, the story is about two Olympians, both of them British, who were competing for the gold medal in the 100-meter race. One of them, his name was Eric Liddell. He was the star of the movie, the person that the movie was about primarily. And Eric worked his entire life for a chance to compete for Olympic gold. The qualifying race that he would have to run at the Olympics in order to get into the race, to race for the gold, he was expected to win that qualifying race very, very easily. But there was a problem. That race was on a Sunday. And for Eric Liddell, Sundays was the day that he observed as his Sabbath, the day that he set aside for God. And all through his career, he never raced on a Sunday. He would never race on a Sunday because that was the day that he had set aside for God. It was the day he dedicated to God. But people would tell him this was different. I mean, I get that, Eric. Listen, I understand. But look, this is the Olympics. Most people very, very few people get a chance to compete for the Olympics. You actually have a chance, and this might be the only opportunity you're going to get. And all you had to do was race this one race on a Sunday, and you would qualify to be able to race for the gold medal. But Eric wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they tried to convince him, he had given that day to God. He had made a commitment to God, and not even an Olympic gold medal was worth it for him to break that. And so despite pressure from everywhere, from the British Olympic Committee, from even the Prince of Wales, he didn't run that race. He didn't qualify to run the 100-meter race for the gold, and Eric never regretted it. Even though he didn't win the gold, he was celebrated all throughout Great Britain and the world for sticking to his convictions. Years later, very few people remember who won the 100-meter gold in 1924, but they remember Eric Liddell. So does that mean that if you go out and run a marathon instead of going to church one weekend that you're breaking your commitment to God? Was that the point of this? No, that's not what I'm trying to say. Listen, here at Gracepoint, we say our mission every week, and our mission starts with the phrase that we meet people where they are. And what that means is that we're all in different places. We're in different places physically, we're in different places emotionally, we are in different places socioeconomically, and yes, we are in different places spiritually. We're all in different places in our walk with God. And so while there are, of course, certain moral imperatives that are common to everybody, there are areas where you and I can disagree, and we can both respond faithfully and differently and be faithful in our walk with God. But here's the thing. No matter where we are in our walk, there is a line for us. And for most of us, we'll say, how do you know where the line is? But for most of us, we know where that line is. We know what we feel like we're supposed to do. We know what we're not supposed to do. But we live in a world right now where it's so easy to compromise. It's so easy to justify our behaviors. And the danger in compromising isn't that one compromise will be our downfall. That's not the danger. The danger is that the one compromise makes the second compromise easier. And that second compromise makes the third compromise even easier than that. And before you know it, you find yourself in this place where you don't even realize that you're compromising. And you don't even see where that has led you or how those compromises have changed you. So in our time today, we're going to look at the life of a person that you may have heard of. If you grew up in church, you may have heard this name, but maybe you've never thought of this person as a villain. Well, he wasn't a villain in the classic sense, but what he did was he let a villainous nature develop inside him. His name was King Saul. King Saul was the king of Israel from about 1050 BC to about 1010 BC. Saul was a tall and handsome man. When you looked at him, he looked like a king. That's the guy that should be king. He was selected to be king, not by the people, but he was selected to be king by God through his prophet, a man named Samuel. You see, Saul was the first king of Israel. He was the first king. Up to this time, Israel was a theocracy. Israel was ruled by God, and God spoke through his prophets. The problem was that the Israelites looked around and they saw all the other nations around them, and they all had kings. And Israel was like, they all have kings. We want to have a king too. And so they asked God for a king, and God gave into their wishes, and he gave them Saul. In fact, Saul's name in Hebrew means the one that was asked for, or the one that was prayed for. And Saul started out as a good king. He started out as a faithful king. He taught the people how to worship God. He brought them back to worshiping the way that the people did when Moses was still around. He built altars to God, and he kept pagan practices out of the kingdom. But somewhere along the line, Saul started to believe his own press. Saul started to believe that everything that was good that was happening to Israel was happening to Israel because of him. Israel had many enemies, and over again, they would fight these enemies, and they were victorious, and the people would praise Saul, and Saul started to believe that everything that was good that was happening to Israel because of him. He had forgotten all about God. So one day Saul is fighting with another nation, the nation of Philistine. He's fighting the Philistines, and his army is heavily outnumbered by their army. And Samuel the prophet tells Saul, listen, I'm going to be back in 7 days, and when I come back, I'm going to offer a burnt offering and a peace offering to the Lord, and then after that offering, you will go out and you will be victorious. Well, 7 days goes by, and there's no Samuel. And Saul starts to panic. And so what he does is he goes and he starts to make the burnt offering and the peace offering on his own. And of course, what happens every time we do something that we're not supposed to do? The person catches us right in the middle of it. And that's exactly what happened to Saul. He was doing it, and Samuel came back and caught him. And Samuel's like, what have you done? You have not obeyed the Lord's command. Well, the Israelites would go on to win that battle. They beat the Philistines, even though Saul only had about 600 men. And Samuel's account tells us that not only did the Philistine army have 3,000 chariots, right? But they had so many men that it was more than the grains of sand on the sea. That's how many men the Philistines had. And Saul, with his 600 men, defeated them. Something that only could happen if God was with them. And you would think that after that, Saul would learn his lesson. But he didn't. And so that takes us to where we are now. And this is how this next event that shows where Saul made a compromise and moved himself farther away from God. This is what it says. It says, one day Samuel said to Saul, Samuel was the prophet, remember? And he's talking to Saul. He says, it was the Lord who told me to anoint you as king of his people Israel. Now listen to this message from the Lord. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I have decided to settle accounts with the nation of Amalek for opposing Israel when they came from Egypt. Now go and completely destroy the entire Amalekite nation. Men, women, children, babies, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys. Whoa. Seems a bit harsh, doesn't it? Everyone, even children and babies. Why would God level such a harsh judgment on the Amalekites? Well, you see, what he was referring to there, what Samuel was saying about what they did to Israel, is something that happened when the Israelites were just coming out of slavery in Egypt, and they were moving from Egypt and trying to move all of these people from Egypt to the land that they were promised. And it's actually written about a few books earlier in the book of Deuteronomy, and this is what it says. It says, never forget what the Amalekites did to you as you came from Egypt. They attacked you when you were exhausted and weary, and they struck down those who were straggling behind. They had no fear of God. Now imagine you have about 1,000,000 men, plus women and children, goats, cattle, all of this stuff that you're trying to move from Egypt to basically the area where Israel is now, and you're trying to move all of them there all together. Now, of course, there's going to be a big, huge clump of people that are moving together, but like with any group, whether it's a group of people or a group of zebras or a group of deer, if you're moving a really, really big group, there are some stragglers that are slow, the weaker ones that kind of hang back and aren't able to move as fast. And what the Amalekites were doing was they were following the Israelites. And when they'd see an older person or a weaker person or a family that was slowing down and was slowly getting separated from the group, they would go in and they would attack them. And they would kill them and take everything that they had. And they would do this over and over again. And God told them, you guys are going to pay for that. It says, therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies in the land he is giving you as a special possession, you must destroy the Amalekites and erase their memory from under heaven. Never forget this. And so this is what Saul is commanded to do by God. And so Saul does it. Now, there was no other reason for Saul to do it. The Amalekites were not a threat to Israel, but God's punishment, God's judgment was being meted out, and Saul was asked to go do it. And so he went to do it. It tells us that Saul slaughtered the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, east of Egypt. It means he got them all. But then look at what he does. He captured Agag, the Amalekite king, but completely destroyed everyone else. Now, this is not what God instructed him. God said, take care of everybody, but instead he kept the king alive. God's instructions were clear, and Saul didn't obey them. Because here's what Saul didn't realize, but he should have realized. Partial obedience is disobedience. As parents, if you're a parent, you understand this. As kids, we try to get away with it, right? When you're a kid, you try to get away with partial obedience. Your mom says, clean your room. And what do? You get all of your clutter and you throw it under your bed, or you throw it into a drawer, or you throw it into a closet. So it looks like it's clean, but you didn't really clean. Partial obedience is disobedience. And that's what Saul was doing. Did he obey God? Partially. But partial obedience is disobedience. And not only that, it says Saul and his men spared Agag's life and kept the best of the sheep and goats, the cattle, the fat calves, and the lambs, everything, in fact, that appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless or of poor quality. Now see, God said to destroy everything. But instead, Saul kept the king alive, and he and his men kept the best of the livestock, the best of the sheep and the goats, the cattle and the lambs. In fact, it says that they kept everything that appealed to them. So that must have been equipment, it could have been money, anything that appealed to them, they held on. Because they were probably thinking to themselves, and listen, in the moment it seems pretty rational, why are we going to destroy all this great stuff? We've already destroyed the nation. The Amalekites are done. Why do we have to destroy all of their things? Why don't we keep this? This is good stuff. And that's what they did. They kept everything that looked good to them, not just the cattle, but the jewelry, the tools, that Ford 4x4 chariot with the lifted rims. They took everything. And of course, God sees what's going on. He sees what they're doing. Saul has had it again. And so God goes to Samuel. He talks to Samuel. He says, the Lord said to Samuel, I am sorry that I ever made Saul king, for he has not been loyal to me and has refused to obey my command. Right? This is a pattern now. It's not just one incident. But it was one incident that led to another incident that led to another one. It was the first compromise, which made the second one easier, which made the next one easier. And this hurt Samuel. In fact, it says that Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this that he cried out to the Lord all night. God was sorry that he made Saul king. Samuel was mourning. But Saul, he was happy as a bee. He didn't even realize that there was anything wrong. Look at what happens next. It says, early in the next morning, Samuel went to find Saul. Someone told him, Saul, he went to the town of Carmel to set up a monument to himself. Then he went on to Gilgal. Remember in the beginning when Saul was first made king and he was setting up monuments to God? Well, not anymore. I mean, what do you put up monuments for, right? You put up monuments as a sign for the person who is responsible for your victory or who is responsible for accomplishing something great. And Saul is now putting up monuments, not to God, but he's putting up monuments to himself, because in Saul's heart and in Saul's mind, he was the reason that they were winning the battles, not God. It was Saul. He couldn't see. He was blinded. When Samuel finally found him, Saul greeted him cheerfully. Hey, may the Lord bless you, he said. I've carried out the Lord's command. Right? Just like that little kid comes down. Hey, Mom, clean my room. No problem. Got it done. Saul's happy, right? He's like, Lord wanted it done? Done. They're gone. And Samuel, who's probably looking at Saul with complete disdain, like, are you kidding me? Are you seriously going to look me in the face and tell me that you did what the Lord commanded you? Right? And you can kind of hear the sarcasm in Samuel's voice when he says, well, if you destroyed everything like the Lord commanded you, and listen to what Samuel says. He says, then what's all of the bleating of sheep and goats and the lowing of cattle I hear? In other words, if you destroyed it all, why am I hearing animals outside? See, Saul was caught. And Saul finally gets that Samuel knows what happened. And so, of course, what does Saul do? Saul does what every little kid does when they're caught. He tries to recover, and he says, it's true that the army spared the best of the sheep, goats, and cattle, Samuel admitted, but they are going to sacrifice them to the Lord, your God. Even in his language, we're starting to see this shift of attitude that Saul has, right? But they're going to sacrifice them to the Lord, your God. Not my God, not our God, your God. See, Saul's saying, look, we didn't save them for us. Okay, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take all that stuff that we got. Yeah, I know we didn't exactly do what we were supposed to do, but listen, we're going to give it to God, right? We're going to go ahead and give it to. This is like the gambler who goes and says, Lord, if you will just let me hit a blackjack, I'm going to give all the money to you. It's the same principle. This is what Saul was doing. We're going to give it all to God. And it's like, sure, yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm sure that was your plan the whole time, right? And Saul says, we have destroyed everything else. And I could just see Samuel looking at him and going, have you? Have you really? And this is what, when we read this story, it seems strange that he would do this, but I really believe that we find ourselves in positions where oftentimes if we were in this position, we do the same thing. Saul is talking to Samuel. He's literally talking to the guy that talks directly to God. Doesn't he think that if God knows everything that's going on, that God told Samuel, that God's talking to Samuel, and so that Samuel knows exactly what has been going on too? Saul doesn't even recognize that the reason that Samuel is there confronting him is because he has a message from God to Saul. And now Samuel's not mourning anymore. Now Samuel is like pissed off, right? He's talking to Saul, and Saul is just annoying him. And so it says, listen, then Samuel said to Saul, stop. Listen to what the Lord told me last night. In other words, he's saying, hey, shut up and listen for a second because I've got something to tell you. And Saul kind of leans back and he says this very dismissively. All right, what did he tell you? What did he tell you? And Samuel told him, although you may think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord has anointed you king of Israel. In other words, remember, Saul, you didn't earn this, right? You didn't go out and win a battle and all the people said, let's make Saul king. You didn't win this. You didn't buy this. You didn't do anything to deserve being the king of Israel. It was God that anointed you. You are king because God made you king. You are victorious because God anointed you, because God has been with you. Samuel goes on and he says, and the Lord sent you on a mission and told you, go and completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, until they are all dead. Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Why did you rush for the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? And I mean, evil. It's like, whoa, evil? I mean, hold on. I didn't follow his instructions like down to the letter, okay? But does that really qualify as evil? In fact, Saul would argue back. He says, but I did obey the Lord, right? Can you just see him, the little kid? But I did clean my room. But I did obey the Lord, Saul insisted. I carried out the mission he gave me. I brought back King Agag, but I destroyed everyone else. And then my troops brought in the best of the sheep, goats, cattle, and plunder, but we're going to sacrifice them to the Lord again, your God, in Gilgal. And Samuel replied, what is more pleasing to the Lord? Your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. See, Samuel is saying, you're performing all these religious rituals, but you're still disobedient to God's voice. See, you're coming to church every week. You're giving, you're volunteering. I mean, listen, you can even be up here talking. You can be up here singing. You can be doing things every single week. But if you ignore God's voice, all of that doesn't mean anything. He goes on and he says, rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness as bad as worshiping idols. See, Samuel is saying that the problem with Saul is rebellion. I know better than what God does. That's Saul's thinking. And the problem that we get is that when we don't listen to God's voice, we put ourselves in God's place. When we know God is leading us down a path or put us in a position where we have to make a decision and we know the decision that God wants us to make and we decide to do something else, what we're basically saying is, listen, if I have to choose between God and God's plan and my plan, God's voice and my voice, I'm going to choose my voice. I'm going to choose my plan because mine is superior to God's. In other words, we're putting ourselves in the position of God in our lives whenever we don't listen to what God has to say. And so Samuel says, so because you have rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And I think that's what finally hit Saul. That's when he finally gets it. So then Saul admitted to Samuel, yes, I have sinned. I have disobeyed your instructions and the Lord's command. And then listen to why he did it. For I was afraid of the people and did what they demanded. See, this whole time, Saul has been trying to argue his way through his actions. But now finally he has to admit it. And even in admitting it, we see the real problem. Saul's pride. Saul wanted everyone to like him. Saul cared more about what the people thought of him than what God thought of him. And he says, but now please forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord. Now see what Saul is saying there? Because see, it still hadn't gotten through to him. He still didn't see that the problem was his pride and his stubbornness. So he goes to Samuel and he says, listen, Samuel, come back with me, right? Come with me. You talk to God. God listens to you. You tell him how sorry I am. Saul thought that a few good words in from Samuel to God would smooth things over with God and God would be okay. Samuel replied, I will not go back with you. Since you have rejected the Lord's command, he has rejected you as king of Israel. As Samuel turned to go, Saul tried to hold him back and tore the hem of his robe. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to someone else who is better than you." On that day, Saul lost his anointing as king. But he would remain king for another 15 years after that. And in that time, Saul doesn't get any better. In fact, Saul gets significantly worse. Worse to the point that he would actually try many times to kill his successor. The person that God anointed right after he lost his anointing, the person that God anointed to be the next king after Saul, a young man named David. This would be Saul's legacy. Saul wouldn't be remembered as a good king or as a victorious warrior. He would be remembered as the king who tried to kill King David, the greatest king of ancient Israel. It ends like this. Then Samuel went home to Ramah, and Saul returned to his house at Gibeah of Saul. Samuel never went to meet with Saul again, but he mourned constantly for him. And the Lord was sorry he had ever made Saul king of Israel. You see, Saul could have been forgiven. Saul could have even saved his reign as king and fulfilled the plans that God had for him. But Saul let his judgment replace God's judgment. Saul let his plans replace God's plans. Saul let his wisdom replace God's wisdom. And the reality for you and me is that it's easy for us to find ourselves in the same place doing the same thing. It's easy for us to make a decision and think to ourselves, well, God, he's so far away, or the time I have to deal with God is so far off, or what possible change in my life would it be if I just did this a little bit differently than I know I'm supposed to do? It's going to make things better for me right now. No one's going to know. No one's going to get hurt. The problem is that when we start compromising, we soon stop seeing them as compromises. Most people don't see it when we make compromises. In fact, most people will look at your partial obedience and will think that you are in full obedience. So what is it that we can do to make sure that we don't fall into the same trap as Saul? Well, listen, it's not about our actions as much as it is about our hearts. And you'll know when there's an issue. You'll know when there's an issue, because when there's an issue, you'll feel a tug. You'll feel a doubt. You'll have someone who you trust in your life bring it to your attention. And my prayer is that when that happens, unlike Saul, you'll listen.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.